Letizia Stauch. In January of 2020, a mother in Colorado Springs called 911 to report that her stepson had vanished from his bedroom in the middle of a snowstorm. She told dispatchers he had simply walked out through the garage, and she had no idea where he had gone. But as investigators began asking questions and checking her story, nothing added up, and what they eventually uncovered would become one of the most disturbing child disappearance cases Colorado had ever seen. Gannon Stauch was a bright and gentle child who loved superheroes, video games, and spending time with his friends. He lived with his biological father, Albert Stauch, and his stepmother, Letitia, in a quiet neighborhood in the Lorson Ranch community. His mother, Landon Hyatt, lived in South Carolina and stayed in regular contact with her son. Gannon dreamed of one day joining the military, inspired by both of his parents who had served. On January 27, 2020, Gannon was home from school, recovering from a minor groin injury. His father, Al, was away on military duty, leaving him in the care of Letitia. That afternoon, Letitia claimed that Gannon left the house to visit a friend. When he did not return, she said she assumed he had simply stayed over. It was not until the following morning that she reported him missing to authorities. From the beginning, investigators found Letitia's behavior troubling. Her timeline was inconsistent, her demeanor seemed oddly detached, and she changed key details of her story multiple times. Neighbor security cameras captured footage of Gannon returning home that afternoon, but never leaving again. When police examined Letitia's vehicle, they found traces of blood in the interior and evidence of an attempted cleanup. Letitia maintained her innocence publicly, even appearing in local media interviews to plead for help in finding her stepson. But behind closed doors, the investigation was closing in. Authorities discovered internet searches on her devices related to body decomposition and methods of disposing of remains. They also found communications suggesting she had been planning something long before January. In early March, Letitia was arrested in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, after leading officers on a chase. She was initially held on charges of child abuse resulting in serious bodily injury. Then, on March 20th, the unthinkable was confirmed. Gannon's remains were discovered beneath a bridge in Payson, Florida, more than 1,500 miles from his home. He had been stabbed, beaten, and shot. What could drive a person to end the life of a child entrusted to their care and then transport his body across multiple states in an attempt to escape accountability? Letitia was extradited to Colorado to face first-degree murder charges. Her trial began in March of 2022, and the prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the forensic findings from her vehicle, her internet search history, and surveillance footage that contradicted her statements. Perhaps most damning was testimony from a fellow inmate who claimed Letitia had confided in her about the crime. The defense pursued an insanity plea, arguing that Letitia suffered from a dissociative identity disorder and was not in control of her actions. She even took the stand and claimed that an alternate personality named Kimmy had committed the act while she was unaware. Mental health experts for both sides offered conflicting assessments, but the jury ultimately rejected the insanity defense. On May 6, 2022, Letitia Stauch was found guilty of first-degree murder, along with charges of tampering with a deceased body and tampering with physical evidence. The following month, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gannon's mother, Landon, delivered a powerful victim impact statement in court, speaking directly to the memory of her son and the pain his loss had caused. She described him as her hero and vowed to honor his legacy by advocating for child safety. As of 2025, Letitia Stauch remains incarcerated in the Colorado Department of Corrections. She has filed appeals challenging her conviction, but none have been successful. Gannon's family has established a foundation in his name to support children in need, ensuring that something good can emerge from an unimaginable tragedy. Sometimes the danger does not come from a stranger lurking in the shadows. Binash Batul. In August of 2023, police in the United Kingdom received a call from authorities in Pakistan with information that would launch one of the most harrowing child welfare investigations in recent British history. A man had walked into a police station in Jhelum claiming that his daughter had passed away back in England and that he had fled the country with his family immediately after. What officers discovered when they entered the family home in Woking, Surrey, would shock the nation. Sarah Sharif was a curious and resilient child who had endured more hardship in her brief life than most adults ever face. She lived with her father Urfan Sharif, her stepmother Binash Batul, and several siblings in what appeared from the outside to be an ordinary suburban home. But behind closed doors, Sarah suffered prolonged and systematic abuse that went undetected by those who might have intervened. On August 10, 2023, Surrey police entered the Sharif residence after receiving the tip from Pakistani authorities. Inside, they found Sarah's body in a bunk bed. A post-mortem examination revealed dozens of injuries across her small frame, including fractures, burns, and bite marks, many of which had occurred over an extended period of time. Medical examiners determined that she had experienced sustained physical trauma in the weeks and months leading up to her passing. Investigators quickly pieced together the timeline. Urfan Sharif, Binash Batul, and Urfan's brother Faisal Malik had boarded a flight to Pakistan just one day after Sarah was last seen alive. Urfan made a call to police before leaving, but his departure made clear that he had no intention of facing immediate scrutiny. For nearly a month, the three remained abroad while British authorities worked to secure their return. In September of 2023, Urfan, Binash, and Faisal returned to the United Kingdom and were promptly arrested. All three were charged with Sarah's death and causing or allowing the death of a child. Evidence presented during the investigation painted a disturbing picture of life inside the Sharif household. Neighbors and school officials had raised concerns about Sarah in the past, but she had been withdrawn from school and largely kept out of sight. Digital evidence and forensic findings suggested that the abuse escalated significantly in the final months of her life. How many warning signs were missed? And how many chances to save this child slipped away? The trial began in late 2024 at the Old Bailey in London. Prosecutors argued that Binash Batul played a direct and active role in the abuse, alongside Urfan Sharif. The defense attempted to shift blame between the defendants, with each pointing fingers at the others. But the evidence of coordinated and sustained cruelty was overwhelming. On December 11, 2024, the jury delivered their verdict. Urfan Sharif and Binash Batul were both found guilty of murder. Faisal Malik was convicted of causing or allowing the death of a child. The judge condemned the defendants for the systematic campaign of violence that Sarah had endured. In February of 2025, sentencing was handed down. Urfan Sharif received a minimum of 40 years in prison. Binash Batul was sentenced to a minimum of 33 years. Faisal Malik received 16 years for his role in failing to protect Sarah. Sarah's biological mother, Olga Sharif, who had been fighting for custody at the time of her daughter's passing, spoke publicly about the failures of the system that had allowed Sarah to slip through the cracks. A serious case review has been launched to examine how multiple agencies missed the signs of abuse. As of 2025, all three defendants remain in custody. Appeals are expected but have not yet been filed. Sarah Sharif's story has prompted renewed calls for reform in how child welfare agencies share information and respond to concerns. What happened to Sarah was not a single moment of violence, but a prolonged failure by those who should have protected her. Olivia Tustin. In the summer of 2021, paramedics in Solihull, England, responded to an emergency call about a child who was unresponsive. When they arrived at the home, they found a boy in catastrophic condition, covered in bruises and barely clinging to life. He had suffered a head injury so severe that doctors knew immediately there was little hope. The child was Arthur Labinjo Hughes, and the adults responsible for his care had spent months subjecting him to unimaginable cruelty. Arthur was a lively and affectionate boy who loved cars and spending time outdoors. Before the pandemic, he had lived with his mother, but after she was incarcerated for taking the life of her partner, Arthur was placed in the care of his father, Thomas Hughes, and Thomas's girlfriend, Olivia Tustin. What should have been a safe haven became a house of horrors. Throughout the COVID-19 lockdowns, Arthur was isolated from the outside world. Extended family members who had previously seen him regularly were cut off. When relatives reached out, they were told everything was fine. But Arthur was enduring daily abuse at the hands of Tustin and Hughes. He was forced to stand for hours at a time, deprived of food, and subjected to physical assaults. Audio recordings recovered from Tustin's phone captured the sound of Arthur crying and pleading for help. On June 16, 2021, Tustin called emergency services to report that Arthur had injured himself. She claimed he had fallen and hit his head. But when medical professionals examined him, they found injuries inconsistent with her account. Arthur had suffered a traumatic brain injury caused by forceful shaking or impact. He also had over 130 bruises on his body, along with signs of salt poisoning from being forced to ingest large quantities of salt as punishment. Arthur was placed on life support, but his injuries were too severe. He passed away on June 17, 2021. He was only 6 years old. The investigation that followed revealed the extent of the abuse Arthur had suffered in the final months of his life. Text messages between Tustin and Hughes showed them mocking Arthur, calling him names, and coordinating their mistreatment of him. Social services had received multiple referrals about concerns for Arthur's welfare, but each time the case was closed without meaningful intervention. How does a child scream for help so many times and still fall through every crack in the system? Olivia Tustin and Thomas Hughes were arrested and charged shortly after Arthur's passing. Their trial began in October of 2021 at Coventry Crown Court. The prosecution presented the audio recordings, text messages, and medical evidence documenting the prolonged nature of the abuse. Tustin denied responsibility for Arthur's fatal injury, while Hughes denied being directly involved in the physical assaults. On December 3, 2021, the jury reached their verdicts. Olivia Tustin was found guilty of murder. Thomas Hughes was convicted of manslaughter for his role in allowing the abuse to continue. The judge described the case as one of the most distressing he had ever encountered. Tustin was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 29 years. Hughes received 21 years in prison. Both sentences were later reviewed by the Court of Appeal. Tustin's minimum term was upheld, while Hughes's sentence was also maintained after the court found it appropriately reflected his culpability. Arthur's grandmother, Madeline Halcrow, became a vocal advocate for child protection reform in the wake of his passing. A national review was launched to examine failures by social services, and new guidelines were implemented to ensure that concerns about at-risk children are not dismissed without thorough investigation. As of 2025, Olivia Tustin and Thomas Hughes remain in prison. The legacy of Arthur's case continues to shape child welfare policy in the United Kingdom, though his family maintains that more must be done to prevent similar tragedies. Arthur deserved protection, and every institution designed to provide it failed him. Mariusz Krasolik. In March of 2012, teachers at a primary school in Coventry, England, noticed that one of their students had become worryingly thin. The boy, Daniel Pelka, was visibly malnourished, and staff observed him scavenging for food in trash bins and stealing scraps from classmates. Despite these alarming signs, no decisive action was taken. 4 months later, Daniel was gone, and the details of what he had endured would expose catastrophic failures at every level. Daniel Pelka was born in Poland and moved to England with his mother, Magdalena Lutzak, when he was still a toddler. After his parents separated, Magdalena began a relationship with Mariusz Krzolik, a man with a history of violent behavior. Daniel and his 2 siblings lived with the couple in a small house in Coventry, but it was Daniel who became the primary target of their cruelty. Over the course of many months, Daniel was starved, beaten, and locked away from the rest of the family. He was forced to sleep in an unheated room and was denied access to regular meals. When food was given to him, it was often laced with salt as a form of punishment. Witnesses later testified that he weighed less than typical children half his age by the time of his passing. On March 3, 2012, emergency services were called to the family home. Daniel was unresponsive, and Lutzak claimed he had fallen and hit his head in the bathtub. Paramedics found a child in an emaciated state, with injuries covering his frail body. He was rushed to the hospital but was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The post-mortem revealed that Daniel had suffered a severe head injury and had been subjected to prolonged physical abuse and starvation. What was striking about Daniel's case was not just the brutality he suffered at home, but the number of times professionals had the opportunity to intervene and did not. School staff had documented their concerns about his weight loss and behavior. A doctor had examined him and noted possible signs of abuse but took no further action. Social services had received referrals that went nowhere. How many adults saw Daniel's suffering and simply looked the other way? Mariusz Krzolik and Magdalena Lutzak were arrested and charged with murder. Their trial began in July of 2013 at Birmingham Crown Court. The prosecution presented evidence showing that both defendants had actively participated in Daniel's abuse and had coordinated efforts to conceal it from authorities. They had provided false explanations for his injuries and kept him isolated from anyone who might help. The defense argued that each defendant blamed the other for the most severe acts of violence, but the jury found both equally responsible. On August 1, 2013, Krzolik and Lutzak were convicted of murder. The judge handed down life sentences to both. Krzolik received a minimum term of 30 years. Lutzak received a minimum of 30 years as well. In his sentencing remarks, the judge stated that Daniel had been treated as an object and subjected to a campaign of cruelty that was almost incomprehensible. Magdalena Lutzak was found unresponsive in her cell at HMP Foston Hall in July of 2015. Her passing was ruled a suicide. Krzolik remains incarcerated. Daniel's case prompted a serious case review that identified at least 26 missed opportunities to save him. Schools, medical professionals, and social services all had contact with Daniel during his ordeal, but failed to connect the dots. The review led to significant changes in how child protection concerns are escalated and investigated in the United Kingdom. As of 2025, Mariusz Krzolik continues to serve his sentence. Daniel Pelka's legacy lives on through the reforms his case inspired, though many believe the systems that failed him still have far to go. A child's silence should never be mistaken for safety. Tiffany Moss. In June of 2013, firefighters in Lawrenceville, Georgia, responded to a call about a structure fire at a modest home in Gwinnett County. After extinguishing the flames, they discovered something that no amount of training could have prepared them for. Inside a trash can, they found the burned remains of a child. She had not died in the fire. She had been gone long before it started, and the blaze was an attempt to destroy the evidence of what had been done to her. Imani Moss was a joyful and sweet child who had faced instability from an early age. After her biological mother struggled with personal challenges, Imani was placed in the care of her father, Emin Moss, and his wife, Tiffany. Family members later said that Imani had been happy in her early years. But after entering Tiffany's household, something changed. The little girl who once smiled freely began to withdraw. In the months leading up to her passing, Imani was systematically starved by Tiffany Moss. She was isolated from extended family, rarely seen by neighbors, and kept home from school. By the time of her death, she weighed only 32 pounds. Her body showed signs of severe malnutrition and dehydration. Medical examiners determined that she had passed away from starvation. Iman Moss confessed to police that he had helped dispose of his daughter's body after finding her unresponsive. He admitted that Tiffany had been withholding food from Imani as punishment, and that he had done nothing to stop it. He claimed he was afraid of his wife and felt powerless to intervene, but investigators noted that he had made no effort to seek help or report the abuse. Why did a father choose to protect his wife instead of his daughter, even after she was gone? Both Iman and Tiffany Moss were arrested and charged with murder, cruelty to children, and concealing a death. Their cases were handled separately due to potential conflicts in their defenses. Iman Moss accepted a plea deal in exchange for his testimony against Tiffany. He pleaded guilty to felony murder and cruelty to children and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. As part of the agreement, he provided detailed testimony about the conditions inside the home and Tiffany's role in Imani's starvation. Tiffany Moss's trial began in April of 2019. She chose to represent herself and offered no opening statement, no cross-examination of witnesses, and no closing argument. She sat silently as prosecutors presented the evidence against her, including Iman's testimony and the medical findings documenting Imani's condition. The jury took less than 3 hours to convict Tiffany Moss of malice murder, felony murder, cruelty to children in the first degree, and concealing a death. During the sentencing phase, she again offered no defense and presented no mitigating evidence. On April 30, 2019, Tiffany Moss was sentenced to death. She became one of the few women on Georgia's death row. The jury found that the prolonged and deliberate nature of her actions warranted the ultimate penalty. Imani's grandmother, Gwen Moss, spoke at the trial about the little girl she remembered, one who loved to dance and sing and had dreams of becoming a veterinarian. She said Imani deserved justice and hoped the verdict would bring some measure of peace to those who loved her. As of 2025, Tiffany Moss remains on death row at Pulaski State Prison in Hawkinsville, Georgia. Her execution date has not been set. Iman Moss is serving his life sentence and will become eligible for parole consideration in 2038. The abuse of a child is always a tragedy, but when that abuse is paired with cold indifference, it becomes something far more difficult to comprehend. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Muhammad Ali bin Johari. In September of 2017, police in Penang, Malaysia, received a report about a child who had been admitted to the hospital with severe burns covering most of her body. The girl, Zubaida Nafisa, was clinging to life in the intensive care unit, and her injuries told a story of prolonged and deliberate cruelty. Within hours, investigators had identified her stepfather as the primary suspect, but what they learned about the final months of her life would reveal a pattern of abuse that had gone unnoticed by nearly everyone around her. Zubaida was a quiet and gentle child who lived with her mother, Zuraida Ghazali, and her stepfather, Muhammad Ali bin Johari. The family resided in a modest apartment in the Air Itam district, where neighbors rarely saw the little girl outside. Those who did encounter her noticed that she seemed withdrawn and fearful, but no one made a formal report to authorities. In the weeks leading up to her hospitalization, Zubaida endured repeated physical assaults at the hands of her stepfather. According to court testimony, Muhammad Ali subjected her to beatings with various objects, scalded her with hot water, and burned her with a heated iron. Her mother, Zuraida, was aware of the abuse but did nothing to intervene or seek help for her daughter. On September 4, 2017, Zubaida was rushed to the Penang hospital after collapsing at home. Doctors found burns covering more than 80% of her body, along with evidence of older injuries that had been left untreated. Despite emergency medical efforts, Zubaida passed away on September 8th. She had suffered for days before anyone brought her to a hospital. How does a child endure such visible suffering without a single adult stepping in to help? Muhammad Ali bin Johari and Zuraida Ghazali were arrested within days of Zubaida's passing. Both were charged with murder under Malaysian law. The investigation revealed that Muhammad Ali had a history of violent behavior and that Zuraida had been complicit in concealing the abuse from relatives and neighbors. The trial took place at the Penang High Court in 2019. Prosecutors presented medical evidence documenting the extent of Zubaida's injuries, along with testimony from hospital staff who treated her in her final days. The defense argued that Muhammad Ali had not intended to cause her death, but the evidence of repeated and escalating violence undermined that claim. On August 26, 2019, Muhammad Ali bin Johari was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. Zuraida Ghazali was convicted of abetting the abuse and received a sentence of life imprisonment. Under Malaysian law, the death penalty is mandatory for murder convictions in certain circumstances. Muhammad Ali's appeals have been unsuccessful, and his execution remains pending. Zuraida continues to serve her sentence. As of 2025, advocates in Malaysia have cited Zubaida's case in calls for stronger child protection laws and better training for teachers and healthcare workers to recognize signs of abuse. Her story remains a painful reminder of what happens when no one speaks up for those who cannot speak for themselves. The failure to protect a child is never the fault of just one person. It is a failure of everyone who looked away. Scott Walker. In July of 2020, a teenager in Peterborough, England, was reported missing by her family. Bernadette Walker had not been seen for weeks, and when police began investigating, they discovered that her father had reported her disappearance only after her school raised concerns about her absence. What followed was a grim search for answers, and the truth that emerged would expose a father who had committed the ultimate betrayal. Bernadette was a bright and creative young woman who dreamed of a career in the arts. She lived with her mother, Sarah Walker, and her stepfather, Scott Walker, along with several younger siblings. By all outward appearances, the family seemed ordinary. But Bernadette had been keeping a painful secret, one that she finally found the courage to reveal in the summer of 2020. Shortly before her disappearance, Bernadette disclosed to family members and authorities that Scott Walker had been abusing her. She provided specific details about the misconduct and hoped that coming forward would protect her and her siblings. Instead, her disclosure set in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. On July 18, 2020, Bernadette was last seen at the family home. Scott Walker later told police that she had run away after an argument, but investigators quickly grew suspicious of his account. Bernadette had left behind her phone, her bank card, and all of her belongings. She had made no contact with friends or extended family, and Scott's behavior in the days following her disappearance raised immediate red flags. What happened to Bernadette Walker in the hours after she revealed the truth about her stepfather? A massive search was launched across Peterborough and the surrounding countryside. Police interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed surveillance footage, and conducted forensic examinations of the family home and vehicles. Despite extensive efforts, Bernadette's remains have never been recovered. Scott Walker and Sarah Walker were arrested in September of 2020. Scott was charged with murder, while Sarah was charged with perverting the course of justice and assisting an offender. Prosecutors alleged that Scott had taken Bernadette's life to prevent her from testifying against him, and that Sarah had helped him conceal the crime. The trial began in March of 2021 at Cambridge Crown Court. The prosecution presented evidence showing that Scott had conducted internet searches related to disposing of a body in the days after Bernadette's disappearance. Cell phone data placed him at remote locations that were inconsistent with his stated whereabouts, and his explanations for her absence changed repeatedly as investigators pressed for details. On March 25, 2021, Scott Walker was found guilty of murder. Sarah Walker was convicted of perverting the course of justice. The jury determined that Scott had acted to silence his stepdaughter and protect himself from prosecution. Scott Walker was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 32 years. Sarah Walker received a sentence of 10 years for her role in obstructing the investigation. The judge noted that Bernadette had shown immense courage in coming forward, and that her bravery had been met with the ultimate act of violence. As of 2025, investigators continue to search for Bernadette's remains. Her family has made public appeals for anyone with information to come forward so that she can be laid to rest. Scott Walker remains in prison with no prospect of early release. Bernadette Walker trusted the adults in her life to protect her. That trust was answered with silence. Dieter Krombach. In 1982, a 14-year-old girl named Kalinka Bamberski collapsed during a summer visit to her mother and stepfather in Germany. She was rushed to the hospital but could not be saved. Her official cause of death was listed as sunstroke, and for years, that was where the story ended. But her biological father refused to accept that explanation, and his decades-long pursuit of justice would eventually expose a crime that had been hidden in plain sight. Kalinka was a vibrant and athletic teenager who lived with her father, André Bamberski, in France. Her parents had divorced when she was young, and her mother, Danuita, had remarried a German cardiologist named Dieter Krombach. Kalinka visited her mother and stepfather during school holidays, and it was during one of these visits that tragedy struck. On July 9, 1982, Kalinka was staying at Krombach's home in Lindau, Germany. According to Krombach, she had spent the day sunbathing and began feeling unwell in the afternoon. He claimed he gave her an iron injection to help with fatigue, a treatment he described as routine. By the next morning, Kalinka was unresponsive. She was pronounced dead at a local hospital. German authorities conducted a brief investigation and accepted Krombach's account. No criminal charges were filed. But André Bamberski was not convinced. He began his own investigation, consulting medical experts who questioned why a healthy teenager would die from sunstroke after receiving an injection from a cardiologist. Over the following years, André uncovered disturbing information about Krombach's past. Multiple former patients came forward with allegations that Krombach had sedated and assaulted them during medical appointments. In 1997, a French court convicted Krombach in absentia for the assault of a 15-year-old patient. Germany refused to extradite him, and he remained free. Why did it take nearly 3 decades for anyone to hold Dieter Krombach accountable for what happened to Kalinka? André Bamberski continued to push for justice, filing lawsuits and petitioning both French and German authorities. In 2009, frustrated by the lack of progress, he took matters into his own hands. He hired private individuals to abduct Krombach from his home in Germany and deliver him to French territory, where he could be prosecuted. In October of 2011, Dieter Krombach finally stood trial in a French court. Prosecutors argued that he had injected Kalinka with a sedative and assaulted her, and that the injection had caused her death. Medical experts testified that her symptoms were inconsistent with sunstroke and consistent with an overdose of sedatives. On October 22, 2011, Krombach was found guilty of causing Kalinka's death through assault. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. It was the first time he had faced any legal consequences for her death. Andrei Bambursky was also prosecuted for his role in orchestrating the abduction. He received a 1-year suspended sentence, with the French court acknowledging his extraordinary circumstances as a grieving father seeking justice for nearly 30 years. As of 2025, Dieter Krombach has completed his sentence and was released from French custody. He returned to Germany, where he is no longer facing active prosecution. Andrei Bambursky continues to speak publicly about his daughter and the flaws in international legal cooperation that allowed her case to go unsolved for so long. Kalinka Bambursky's story is a reminder that the pursuit of justice sometimes falls to those who loved the victim most. Heather Lavelle Keaton. In March of 2012, a couple in Gadsden, Alabama, called 911 to report that their son had fallen and was not breathing. When paramedics arrived, they found a toddler with injuries that told a very different story. The child, Natalie Lavelle Keaton, had been severely beaten, and her small body showed evidence of prolonged mistreatment. Within hours, she was gone, and investigators turned their attention to the adults who were supposed to keep her safe. Natalie was an energetic and curious child who had been placed in the care of her biological father, Joshua Lavelle, and his wife, Heather Lavelle Keaton, after her biological mother lost custody. The couple lived in a trailer in the Rainbow City area, and friends and family described their household as chaotic. Natalie and her siblings were often seen with unexplained bruises, but no formal reports were made to Child Protective Services. In the weeks before her passing, Natalie's condition deteriorated rapidly. She lost weight, became less responsive, and stopped playing the way she once had. Heather later admitted to investigators that she had been disciplining Natalie with excessive physical force, including striking her with a belt and slamming her against hard surfaces. On March 17, 2012, Natalie suffered a fatal head injury inside the family trailer. Heather claimed the toddler had fallen off a bed, but medical examiners found that her injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma inflicted by an adult. Natalie also had healing fractures and internal injuries that indicated prior abuse. How does a child suffer so visibly and so often without anyone stepping in to protect her? Heather Lavelle Keaton and Joshua Lavelle were arrested and charged with capital murder. Prosecutors alleged that both had participated in the abuse that led to Natalie's death and that they had acted with deliberate cruelty. The legal proceedings stretched over several years due to multiple delays and pretrial motions. In 2016, Joshua Lavelle accepted a plea agreement in exchange for his testimony against Heather. He pleaded guilty to felony murder and received a sentence of life with the possibility of parole. Heather Lavelle Keaton's trial took place in 2017. The prosecution presented testimony from Joshua, medical experts, and investigators who had documented the abuse Natalie suffered. The defense argued that Heather had not intended to cause her stepdaughter's death, but the evidence of repeated violence over an extended period undermined her claims. On May 11, 2017, Heather Lavelle Keaton was found guilty of capital murder. The jury recommended the death penalty, and the judge imposed the sentence. She became one of the few women on Alabama's death row. Natalie's extended family has spoken publicly about the loss of a child who never had the chance to grow up. They have called for reforms to the child welfare system to ensure that children in similar situations are not overlooked. As of 2025, Heather Lavelle Keaton remains on death row at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama. Her appeals are ongoing. Joshua Lavelle is serving his sentence and will eventually be eligible for parole. Natalie Lavelle Keaton spent her final months in fear and pain. Her story demands that we pay closer attention to the children who cannot ask for help. These cases remind us that the people entrusted to care for children do not always have their best interests at heart. The systems meant to protect the vulnerable failed each of these victims in different ways, and their stories demand that we do better. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.